appreciate you all so much. You have no idea how much I do appreciate you that coming back to the channel. And of course, welcome to the ones out there that have not been to the channel before, and this is your first time. Welcome. So, I am Jodi. This is the Australian Outback deserted highway murder. So these two young kids back in November 15th, 2000, from the UK, Peter Falconio and his girlfriend Joanne-Lees. They leave the United Kingdom. They plan on visiting Nepal, Thailand, Cambodia, Australia, New Zealand, Fiji, and America. Now, of course, I've been to America, but Fiji and the Maldives, I'm dying to go to. So, back to the case. So it is going to be a wonderful trip for these two. They're excited, they're packed, they're ready to go. They have everything in place. Well, by January 16th, 2001, they arrived in Australia. Their first stop to Australia was Sydney, where they worked to save up money for the next leg of their trip. On June 25th, they said goodbye to Sydney and drove off in their orange camper van headed towards Canberra, Melbourne, and then South Australia. During this time, what they did was they stayed in the camper at campgrounds and along the side of the road at laybys, which would be like rest areas here in the US. July 11th had the couple in Uluru, where they met some Canadian backpackers. Peter and Joanne gave them a lift to the Kings Canyon at the Watarak National Park. So then they spent the next day sightseeing, having a good time, relaxing. They went to Alice Springs, and they slept in one of those laybys, not in an actual park, like a RV park or, specific place. It's kind of just on the roadside, pull off, like a rest area. Peter had to meet with an accountant on July 14th. So while working in Australia, he had paid taxes as an Australian resident rather than a non-resident and needed to change his status. He also bought a ticket for a trip to Papua New Guinea that he planned to take later in the year with a friend. Joanne, well, what did she do? She spent the day at the local Alice Springs library, checking emails. Later, she called her friend in Sydney to talk about her and Peter's upcoming adventures, which I'm sure I can't even imagine. Honestly, that's like a trip of a lifetime. Around 4 p.m. that afternoon, the couple got back in the camper van and headed north. Joanna was driving while Peter laid in the back and read The Catcher in the Rye. A little after 6, they fueled up at the Thai Tree Roadhouse and shared a joint while watching the sunset. So they were nice and relaxed, I am sure. When they headed back out, Peter drove them as they continued up the Stewart Highway. He noticed that a Toyota 4W SUV had been following them since leaving the roadhouse. As the vehicle looked to be passing them, Peter saw the driver was motioning for him to pull over. does other than, hey, pull over. That would make me very nervous, as was Joanna, was nervous about stopping on the isolated road. But Peter, I'm sure as an optimist, assured her everything would be fine. So he gets out of their van and he approaches the SUV. Peter calls out, "Cheers, mates." Then the driver told him that he had noticed sparks coming out of the back of the van. Now I think, if you disagree with me, let me know, but I think that they would have noticed if sparks were coming out the back of their van. As Peter and the other driver headed behind the van, he called out to Joanna to get ready to rev the engine. She slid behind the wheel. Why don't I keep that making that noise? She slid behind the wheel and got ready, but instead was shocked by a loud bang. So, before she had a chance to even react, the other driver was at her window with a gun in hand. So he gets her out of the van immediately because she's panicked. She's wondering where her boyfriend is. What he does, he ties her hands behind her back with black cable ties and then forces her into his car with his dog. So I'm sure she is absolutely terrified. And where is her boyfriend? Where's Peter? So her attacker is busy doing something by her van. She is able to escape into the bush and hide. She hid for over 5 hours while her attacker was searching for her. After midnight, another driver finally came along and she was able to get help. So she flags him down. And of course, she's frantic about the area where the attacker was and found some footage of the attacker at a Shell truck stop in Alice Springs. So maybe he saw them there. Because remember, they spent the day before in Alice Springs. So casually, he's fueling up and buying an iced coffee. So they go back to the crime scene. They actually do find some footprints. However, it turns out to be Joanne's. Investigators called in the Aboriginal trackers from a nearby settlement, but they were unable to locate any evidence about Peter or his attacker. Now this must be absolutely terrifying to Joanne, that how could her boyfriend and this attacker completely disappear with no trace? So at this time, they're not in rescue or recover mode. They're looking to rescue an injured victim. They're hoping he's still alive. Hoping, and they kind of were assuming, but in my eyes, I would just be hoping that the attacker had left him wounded. They thought that possibly the killer would have just discarded the body by the vehicle since Joanne had gotten away. However, as we'll find out, they start questioning Joanne, and not as a victim and witness, but as if she was involved. So then they start thinking of her more as a suspect. They said her statements and demeanor started to change over the weeks following the incident, slowly including her attacker's face, his vehicle description, and what kind of dog he had. Well, I mean, that could just be sheer fear. I mean, if I think back to weeks before if I've had a traumatic experience, the last thing I'm going to be thinking of is, oh, that's a great German Shepherd you have over there. I'm going to be thinking of getting the heck out of there, right? That's just me, but they get back the DNA samples that they pulled from Joanne's shirt, and it came back as an unknown male. So it did match the DNA on the cable ties used on her hands and inside the camper van on the gear shift. And it was not a match to Peter. So now police release CCTV footage of the driver at the gas station, praying he would come forward and explain his side of the story. Obviously, I'm sure it's no surprise to anybody that he did not report himself to the police. They did get other callers, though. They said they recognized the driver and his vehicle. So they matched this up against all the registered owners of Toyota Land Cruisers 4-wheel drive vehicles. One name on that list was Bradley John Murdoch. But the police did not contact him or request a DNA sample for some reason. So this is a different case and a different crime. 2 years later, May 17th, 2002, a man is arrested due to drug charges. To lessen his charges, he said he had information on a friend who killed someone. His friend was named no other than Bradley John Murdoch. The details of this crime seem to fit with the highway disappearance and attack that happened the previous year, really 2 years ago. familial match to the attackers. But Murdoch had gotten wind of the pending arrest and he got the heck out of there. On August 22nd, 2002, Murdoch was arrested by the South Australian police on a different kidnapping and assault charge. But we still don't know what happened to Peter. I guess he just, we want to know what happened to her poor boyfriend. And I can't believe that would really upset me if they started accusing me of setting my boyfriend up to be murdered. That would really upset me. So what happened to this Mr. Murdoch? On December 13th, 2005, a jury found Bradley John Murdoch guilty, and he's given a life imprisonment sentence with a 20-year non-parole period, which means that after 28 years, he can get parole. In court, Murdoch had actually been acquitted previously of aggravated sexual assault on a mother and daughter in South Australia years before attacking Peter and Joanna. But he was acquitted. So to date, Murdoch still refuses to let Peter Falconio's family know what he did with the body. Nothing has ever been found. So, as of 2017, however, an anonymous letter was mailed to ND News saying that Murdoch had cut Falconio's body up, quote, end quote, and put it into large bags. Murdoch then asked a friend to take the bags and dissolve them in acid, but the friend supposedly buried the bags in a remote area of Western Australia. Now, the problem is that Australia, there are cities, and then there are millions of acres of just nothingness. And honestly, if somebody was buried in that part of Australia, that just, it would be swallowed up. You would never find it unless it was just by sheer luck. So as of, today, his body has not yet been found. So next I'm going to talk about, it's kind of two cases in one. So this is the backpack serial killer murders. Now this was earlier. Remember I had brought this up a little bit earlier. So there was a serial backpack murderer in Australia. And literally, this put the country on edge. And it left piles of bodies scattered throughout a state forest. People would just walk up on these bodies and find remains. And like I was saying, the vastness of Australia, parts of Australia, it would almost be impossible to find someone if it wasn't just by happenstance. So there were two discoveries in September of 1992. So we are going to go back in time a little bit. Runners in the Belanglo State Forest found a decomposing body. And the next day, police found a second corpse about 100 feet away. So the Belanglo State Forest is located in Australian state Australia. It's, quote, beast of the bush, Brit girls victims of Oz serial killer, unquote. Autopsies revealed the brutal torture that both victims have suffered before being killed and buried in the woods. Joanne Walters had been stabbed a total of 14 times, once in the neck, 4 times in the chest, and 9 in her back, which had paralyzed her. Caroline Clark appeared to have been used for target practice with a gun. Can you believe this? Oh, this is just heartbreaking. She had been shot in the head 10 times. After seeing this brutality of kills, I mean, what do the police do? So they widened their search in the Belanglo State Forest for more bodies, but nothing was ever found at that point. Not until October 1993, the third and fourth bodies were discovered. So a man just out gathering firewood in a remote area of the forest. He's just picking up wood and he finds bones. He calls the police, sure frantic. And when police excavate the site, they find the remains of 2 human beings. I'm sure this man never went to look for firewood ever again, or definitely not in that area. Identified as James Gibson and Deborah Everest, a Victorian couple missing since December 30th, 1989. Mr. Gibson's body was unearthed. He was in the fetal position. Now, what had happened to him? He had been stabbed 8 times with a large knife. One slice had cut through his spine, causing paralysis, similar to the first 2. He had also been stabbed multiple times in the back, the chest, and had punctures to his heart and lungs. I have to say this. If this guy paralyzes his victims first and then kind of plays with them or keeps them alive, I can't imagine. I mean, that is sick. So Deborah Everest had been beaten severely. Her skull had been fractured in 2 places. Her jaw was broken. She had knife marks on her forehead. She had been stabbed in the back. Police had not been looking anywhere near the Belanglo Forest for the missing couple since James Gibson's camera had been found December 1989 on the 31st in northern Sydney. So nowhere near this forest. March 13th, 1990, his backpack was then found near the Galston Gorge, 75 miles. Now, 75 miles is a long way from the forest where their bodies were then recovered years later. Oh, this is, something is going on. In the Belanglo Forest, there are 3 more bodies, so the 5th, 6th, and 7th victims were discovered. November 1st, 1993, police decided to perform a sweep of a fire trail in the Belanglo Forest, and they found a skeleton. And this remains belonged to Simone Schmindel from Germany, and she had been missing since January 20th, 1991. Simone had been stabbed at least 8 times, having severed her spine twice, punctured her lung and heart, along with the body. Particular items of clothing were found, but after examining them, it was determined, however, they did not belong to Simone. Instead, they belonged to another missing backpacker, Anya Habshed. So, this German couple, Gabor and Anya, had disappeared on December 25th, 1991. I can't imagine what the country is thinking, or backpackers that are there backpacking, or the ones that had gone through this area and had been lucky to make it through alive. That would be the first thing in my head if I had. Apparently this is a pretty, it's like me being here hiking and backpacking and camping. It's a very popular place for people to come and backpack, probably feeling very safe because it's the open wilderness. Well, the police again extended the search to locate Gabor and Anya's bodies on another fire road in Shallow Graves on November 4th, 1993. So the couple was buried nearly 160 feet apart. This indicates to police that they possibly could have been killed at different times. So maybe the killer took them somewhere, maybe killed one there and then took the other for, to torture or to whatever. I just can't imagine. Because Anya had been decapitated. So this is the killer, apparently just really angry. I mean, they didn't know he didn't know these people, and an extensive search did not turn up her skull ever. Gabor had been shot in the head 6 times. What are the police to do? So finally, after 7 bodies are found, they decide that, okay, we have a serial killer on our hands, or we need to get something put together to find who's ever doing this, because the murders are so similar. This has to be the same person, or possibly one person with an accomplice. So they did start a task force, and they issued public warnings to all backpackers to steer clear of the Hume Highway and to be careful of their surroundings. Well, thank goodness. I mean, it only took 7 bodies. Jeez Louise. Knowing where their killer hunted, they used link analysis to run the vehicle records from the roadways. Now, can you believe this? Because when I first read this, I was in shock. They narrowed down the list with gym membership records, gun licensing, and police reports to a list of only 32 suspects. That's amazing. I think, why didn't they do this sooner? I don't know. I guess it wasn't, all the bodies weren't found. I don't know. I could, kill myself with the, why not? So what is this killer thinking? What were the police thinking? All of the victims were brutally killed. Most of them did not die right away from their injuries, but were left to linger in pain. Their bodies had been buried, then covered by, listen to this, a pyramid made of sticks and ferns. And almost all of them had been sexually assaulted. So this is a very Sick human being. Around each burial site, a campsite was located nearby, so not only did he murder these poor innocent people, but he then stayed there with his victims, either to keep them alive and torture them over days and watch them suffer, or just to make sure they were dead, or to just hang out with them. That's what the police believe. Because the campsite had been well worn in. At every single site where the bodies were found, there was a campsite next to it. Paul Onions, on November 13th, 1993, from UK, called the police to talk about an incident that happened to him 3 years earlier. So he had been backpacking in Australia, and he called the police because in January of 1990, he had an encounter on his way to Madura. He had hitched a ride from a man named Bill. Well, they drove along, chatting away, and Bill starts asking these strange and very unnerving questions. Like, for instance, did anyone know where he was going? Was anyone waiting for him? I guess he was going to Canberra. Was anybody waiting for him there? Had he done any special forces? Now, this is a very strange question. Had he done any special forces training in the Navy? I would have jumped out of the car. So, on an isolated stretch, this is what Mr. Onions is saying. On an isolated stretch of road, just outside the Belanglo forest, Bill pulls over his vehicle onto the side of the road, and he draws a gun and ropes on him. So Bill tells him this is a robbery. So Mr. Onions knows his life. He's about to be killed. He quickly gets out of the car and starts to run. And Bill chases after him and fires off a shot. Luckily for Mr. Onions, another motorist is coming along at the right moment, literally in the middle of nowhere on a deserted road. I mean, thank goodness, right? So they stop and help him. That's another thing. I mean, because not everybody will stop and help somebody trying to flag him down, because they're also afraid that that person could be maybe trying to rob them or hurt them. But they did stop. He gets in and he tells them what happened, and they go straight to the police. They sit down and describe the attacker with the police officers, and the vehicle that he was driving was a Bowral police, with the Bowral Police Department. And after getting this tip from Mr. Onions, so they put together the report as much as it could. But the weird thing is that it went missing. But luckily, a constable had taken detailed notes in her logbook and still had it stored away. Thank goodness. So I don't know, that little piece of information just kind of gnaws at me a little bit. Just because, why would that disappear? That's what I'm thinking. I mean, they know all these murders have taken place by this time. Why would that information just disappear? Thank goodness for the constable that did keep good notes. So this information provided his name, Ivan Milat. This name was also on the list of suspects they had narrowed down on those 32 people. Remember, with the cars? Another place his name showed up was in a call from a woman whose boyfriend worked with Ivan Milat. She told the police that they needed to look into him as the backpack serial killer. That is ironic. It just bothers me when police just won't look into things. I don't know if they don't believe people or they don't want to take the time. They don't have the resources. But it's always too bad when I hear this, because I think, oh my gosh, this guy could have been arrested so maybe preventing, the demise of poor innocent people. So they arrested Ivan Milat. They actually set up surveillance on February 26, 1994 on Milat. They learned that he had sold his vehicle, so he was driving a Nissan Patrol four-wheel drive shortly after the first two bodies were discovered. So he's like, what the heck, I'm getting rid of this. He wanted nothing to do with that, because basically all they had was that information. After looking into what he did for work and his history, it was determined that he had not been at work at any of the days the victims disappeared. So, that is an awful big coincidence, if you ask me. So in 1994, on May 4th, Mr. Onions goes back to Australia, and he looks at a lineup of men where Mr. Ivan Milat was, of course, in. And immediately he points to him and says, "That is the man who tried to kill me." So on May 22nd of 94, Ivan Milat was arrested on robbery and weapons charges for the attack on Mr. Onions. After all of this, he's arrested, he's behind bars, they get a search warrant for his property. Now, this is so disturbing. They found weapons and knives and rifles and rifle parts, and then parts to a .22 caliber Ruger 1022 that matched the type used in all of the murders. But more damning was the clothing, the tent, sleeping bags, cameras, various items that belonged to the deceased victims. I can't imagine. I can't imagine the horror that they must have gone through. The police also searched the homes of Milat's families, where they found more weapons, more items that belonged to the backpackers that had been murdered. The trial is March 26, 1996. He pleads, of course, not guilty, because he's not guilty, right? In the end, he was found guilty of all 7 murder charges and given a life sentence for each victim. So he was also found guilty for the imprisonment and robbery of Paul Onion and received 6 years for each crime. Now, there were other potential victims that are listed. Karen Rowland, Peter Ledger, Diane Benaccio, Leanne Goodall, Robin Hickey, Amanda Robinson, and a few other women had gone missing in the area when Ivan was around, but not been charged in any other cases to date. So, as an attorney, everyone's like, oh, attorneys, never turn on their clients. Well, the Milat family had a defense defense attorney John Marston. And on July 18th, 2005, he was dying and he needed to clear his conscience. But he wasn't just an attorney for Ivan, but for the entire family. So he knew everything about them. Marston gave a statement that not only said that Ivan had confessed to him and he killed all of the victims, but that he had his sister, Shirley Swar, help him. So during Milat's trial, Justice David Hunt said he believed that Milat had not worked alone. Hunt presented evidence that more than one killer was working together to kill several of the victims. And he even suggested that one of the Milat siblings was involved, so he was dead on. I mean, wow. I mean, either he had inside information or he had great intuition. So he continued to deny ever having to do with any of the deaths or murders. He died of cancer at the age of 74 in prison. So the thing is that apparently the Milat family, let's just say the apple doesn't fall far from the family tree. In 2012, Ivan Milat's his great-nephew, Matthew Milat, had killed a friend in the Pelanglo forest. So, you know what he says? I'm sorry, this is so arrogant and so... I just want to choke this guy. He says, as a joke, he starts laughing about the killing. He says, quote, "That's what the Milats do," unquote. He was sentenced to 30 years in prison. What? That's what Milats do? You've got to be kidding me. And what makes me so angry is that his sister was never brought up on charges. I guess they didn't have any evidence except for the deathbed confession and the theory that Mr. Hunt had during the trial. But, oh well. That is I thought that they were kind of go together, so I wanted to do them together. The backpack murders and then the highway murders. So, I believe that in some way they're so similar